All right, ready to dive into another chapter of history. Today, we're tackling a big one, but with a twist. We're not just talking about the Mongol invasion. We're talking about how it shaped Russia in ways you might not expect.
It's a fascinating period, isn't it? Because we often focus on the invasion itself, the chaos, the destruction.
Exactly. But the Mongol impact on Russia goes way beyond the battlefield.
Well, absolutely. We're talking governance, culture, even language. They left their mark everywhere.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Our main source, by the way, is this article on How to Russia called The Mongol Invasion, How the Golden Horde Shaped Russian Identity.
Great article. It really digs into the nuances of this period.
It really does. So let's start with the basics. The Golden Horde at its peak was massive, right?
Absolutely. We're talking a huge swath of territory, from Eastern Europe all the way to Siberia.
Wow. Okay, so imagine the logistical challenges of controlling that much land. How did they do it? What made them such a powerful force?
Well, their military prowess was undeniable. They were incredibly disciplined, masters of strategy and horsemanship.
By the classic image of the Mongol warrior on horseback.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The Golden Horde wasn't some kind of monolithic force. It was actually a collection of different tribes, all with their own agendas, brought together under this Mongol banner.
So managing this huge empire must have taken incredible administrative skills.
It did, and that's something we often overlook. The Mongols were surprisingly sophisticated administrators. They set up systems of taxation, communication networks, even fostered trade routes like the Volga River, which brought them significant wealth.
Okay, so hold on. We're talking about a group known for conquering and raiding, but they were also capable of establishing this complex, functioning society.
Exactly. They weren't just about brute force. They understood how to build and manage an empire. It makes you wonder what it must have been like for those living under their rule.
Right. Like, what was the reality on the ground for the Russian principalities who suddenly found themselves part of this new world order?
It definitely wasn't easy. Imagine the pressure of being a tributary state. Knowing that a powerful overlord is dictating your every move.
And knowing that your resources are being funneled away to support this distant power.
Exactly. This wasn't a partnership. It was a system designed to benefit the Mongols.
It sounds like a recipe for resentment and rebellion. So how did the Russian principalities handle it?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Because the Mongol system, while meant to keep them in control, had this unintended consequence.
What do you mean?
It actually set the stage for greater unity among the Russian principalities and, eventually, the rise of a centralized Russian state.
Now that's a plot twist. I would have thought a conquering force would want to keep its subjects divided and weak.
You would think so, right? But the Mongols, they were pragmatists. They wanted things to run smoothly so they could extract resources efficiently. And that meant, in their eyes, dealing with a single, strong leader.
So you're saying the seeds of Moscow's rise were sown in part by the very force trying to control them.
Exactly. It's one of those fascinating ironies of history.
It really is. Okay, so let's talk about this rise of Moscow a bit more. We're essentially talking about the shift from a bunch of separate principalities to this dominant power in the region. When did that happen?
Well, it was a gradual process, of course, but the Mongol period was really pivotal. Remember how I mentioned they preferred dealing with a single, strong leader?
Yeah, to make things easier for themselves.
Right, and that's where the Grand Prince of Moscow comes in. They were able to use this system to their advantage.
How so?
Well, they were able to consolidate their power, build up their military, and even expand their territory, all under the watchful eye of the Golden Horde.
It's like they played the game better than anyone else.
They did, and in doing so, they laid the foundation for a powerful, centralized Russian state, which, ironically, would eventually challenge the Mongols themselves.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, isn't it?
Never. There are always these unintended consequences, these ripple effects that play out over generations.
Absolutely. And which the key elements of this system, as you mentioned, was the Kormleni system, right?
Yes. Kormleni essentially means feeding, and it was a way for the Mongols to, well, feed their agents, their tax collectors, their officials.
So instead of paying them directly.
Exactly. They said, here, go govern this territory, collect taxes from the people, and that's your payment.
Clever, but also...
Brutal. Yeah, it could be pretty harsh.
And for the Russian princes, it must have been this weird balancing act, right?
Absolutely. On one hand, they had to appease the Mongols, make sure those taxes were flowing.
Right, because if you don't...
You could be replaced, or worse. But on the other hand, it created an incentive to build up their own power base.
to make their own territories as prosperous as possible so they could skim more off the top.
You got it. So, ironically, this system designed to maintain Mongol control actually pushed the Russian principalities, especially Moscow, to become more centralized, more efficient, more like, well...
More like the powerful state it would become.
Exactly. It's like the Mongols accidentally laid the groundwork for their own eventual rivals. But it wasn't just about politics and economics, though. There's another layer to this whole story that we can't ignore.
Cultural exchange.
Exactly. We tend to think of the Mongols as this overwhelming, culturally dominant force, but the reality is far more interesting than that.
Okay. I'm intrigued. So we're not just talking about goods and technologies being traded, but ideas, art, ways of life.
Absolutely. It was a two-way street, a real mixing pot of Eastern and Western traditions.
Give us some examples. What are some things that made their way into Russian culture from the Mongols?
We'll take a look at Russian architecture from that period. You'll see elements of Eastern design, these beautiful, intricate details incorporated into churches and public buildings.
So the Mongol influence is right there, literally etched into the landscape.
Exactly. And it goes deeper than just architecture. Even Russian literature and folklore were influenced by Mongolian storytelling traditions and epics.
Wow, so we're talking about a deep, lasting impact on Russian culture.
Yeah.
Not just a superficial borrowing, but a real blending of traditions.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a one-way street. The Mongol invasion also sparked the emergence of distinctly Russian cultural expressions.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Think of the Bogotyrs, those legendary heroic warriors of Russian folklore. They embody strength, courage, resistance. They emerged as cultural icons, in part as a response to the Mongol threat.
That's fascinating. It's like this cultural dialogue, this back and forth between these two distinct cultures.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that even under the shadow of conquest, culture finds a way to adapt, to evolve, and yes, even to resist. And speaking of adaptation and resistance, we can't forget about the impact on language.
Ah, yes, let's talk about that. I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn just how much of the Russian language has roots in the Mongol period.
It's true. Centuries of interaction, of living side by side, inevitably led to some linguistic exchange.
So it wasn't a case of the Mongols forcing their language on the Russian population.
Not at all. It was more organic, more of a gradual blending. And what's fascinating is how many Mongolian words have become so integrated into the Russian language that most people don't even realize their origins.
Okay, so spill the tea. Give us some examples of these linguistic leftovers from the Mongol era. What words do we use today that have those Mongol roots?
Oh, there are quite a few. But let's start with a simple one. A word you probably use all the time. Yam.
Yam, as in like a sweet potato.
Not quite. Today, it's used more generally to mean pit, but it originally referred to the Mongol system of post stations, these relay stations that allowed for quick communication and travel across their vast empire.
Wow. So a simple word like yam carries all this historical baggage. That's amazing.
It is. And it's a reminder that the Mongol legacy in Russia is often hidden in plain sight. And it's not just individual words either. Some grammatical structures in the Russian language can even be traced back to Mongolian influence.
So it's a subtle but significant reminder of this period of intense interaction and exchange.
Absolutely. But while the Mongols' impact on Russian culture and language is undeniable, their grip on power wouldn't last forever.
Right. Eventually, the Golden Horde began to decline. What happened? Was it a sudden collapse or more of a slow fade?
It was more of a slow decline, really, like a fire slowly burning itself out. A combination of factors contributed: internal conflicts, external pressures from other groups, and, ironically, the growing strength of those Russian principalities, especially Moscow.
So it's like they planted the seeds of their own demise.
In a way, yes. But it's important to remember that history is full of these unintended consequences.
Right. It's rarely a simple case of cause and effect. It's more like a tangled web.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if we had to pinpoint a moment, a turning point where things really started to shift, it would have to be the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380.
This is where the Russian forces, led by Dmitry Donskoy, finally challenged the Mongols head-on.
Right.
Exactly.
And they won a decisive victory, which had huge symbolic significance.
It's almost like that victory shattered this aura of Mongol invincibility.
It definitely sent a message. The Mongols could be beaten. And this victory really galvanized the Russian spirit, especially in Moscow. It fueled their ambition, their sense of national identity. And from there, the decline of the Golden Horde became more pronounced.
It's incredible to think that the Mongols' own system, designed to keep them in control, ultimately contributed to their downfall. By empowering Moscow, by inadvertently fostering the conditions for a unified Russian state, they really sealed their fate, which, again, just shows how complex and unpredictable history can be. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about the psychological impact of Mongol rule on Russia. We've covered the political, the economic, the cultural, the linguistic legacies. But what about that less tangible impact? How did living under Mongol rule for so long shape the Russian psyche?
It's a question that historians still debate today. Some argue that it instilled this deep-seated sense of caution, this awareness of vulnerability to outside threats that's kind of woven into the Russian worldview.
Which makes sense, right? When you've lived with that threat of invasion and domination for generations, it's bound to leave a mark.
Exactly. Others argue that it fostered a certain pragmatism, a willingness to adapt to survive, even collaborate with powerful forces when necessary. Some even see echoes of this in Russian foreign policy today.
Interesting. So a kind of, if you can't beat them, join them mentality.
Well, it's more complex than that, of course, but there's no denying that the Mongol period left a deep mark on the Russian psyche. It shaped their attitudes towards power, authority, and even their place in the world. It's fascinating, really.
It makes you wonder how things would have unfolded if the Mongol invasion had never happened. Would Russia be the same nation it is today, with the same culture, the same global influence? It's one of those unanswerable questions that makes history so captivating. But what we do know is that the Mongols, whether we realize it or not, are part of the Russian story. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of the nation.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's messy, it's full of surprises, and it's full of these unexpected connections that shape who we are today.
Well said. I think our listeners are walking away from this deep dive with a much richer understanding of this pivotal period in history. It's a reminder that the past isn't just something we study, it's something we carry with us. It's in our languages, our cultures, even our ways of thinking.
It's true, and that's why we need to keep exploring it, keep questioning our assumptions, and keep uncovering these hidden connections that make history so fascinating.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but trust us, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you in the next episode.